Imagine living in a country where every detail of your life is meticulously controlled, where freedom is just a distant idea, and where the absurd merges with the reality of everyday life. A place where the government decides what car you drive, what color it should be, and even how you should organize your daily routine. It sounds like a work of dystopian fiction, doesn't it? But such a place exists, and its name is Turkmenistan. Today, we're going to delve into one of the most bizarre and oppressive regimes on the planet, where the absolute power of its leaders has turned the lives of millions of people into a living nightmare. We're going to explore a territory where the cult of personality reaches unimaginable levels. Laws defy all logic, and daily life is shaped by the whims of a government that seems to have come out of a fictional story. Get ready to discover how Turkmenistan, a nation that emerged from the fall of the Soviet Union, became a laboratory for some of the most insane policies ever seen. In this story, nothing is common or predictable, and each new revelation carries with it a new concept of reality. In 1991, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Turkmenistan emerged as an independent nation, but what seemed like a new beginning soon turned into one of the most surreal and oppressive dictatorships in modern history. The country, located in Central Asia, began to be ruled by Saparmurat Niyazov, known as Turkmen, the Great Leader, who established a regime of absolute control over every aspect of the citizens' lives. Niyazov's rise to power was no accident. Taking advantage of the post-Soviet instability, he proclaimed himself the supreme leader, establishing a power base that ran into unimaginable absurdities. But the real madness would come with his decrees and the totalitarian control he imposed, restricting the most basic rights and even freedom of movement. One of the first and most insane decrees was the prohibition of his citizens from leaving the country. In an inhumane move, Niyazov ordered all exits to be sealed off, effectively turning Turkmenistan into a prison of continental proportions. Any attempt to leave the country resulted in severe punishments, with citizens being forced to give up their very freedom. But the situation was even more desperate for the citizens who found themselves forced to live under the constant surveillance and whims of the government. In addition, the figure of the president was constructed as an almost divine entity, unbeatable, an omnipresent presence. The cult of personality became one of the pillars of the regime, with his image stamped on every corner, from grandiose monuments to the national currency itself. Niyazov surrounded himself with a system of propaganda and control, where any dissenting voice or criticism of the government was brutally and mercilessly silenced. When we talk about the most insane regime on the planet, we cannot fail to highlight the bizarre acts that defined Turkmenistan's governance. The governance decrees were so eccentric and ridiculous that they became a laughing matter for many outside the country. However, for citizens, they were a suffocating reality that demonstrated the extent of the government's control over everyone's lives. One of the most surreal examples of Niyazov's rule was the ban on black cars. In 2018, a government measure decreed that all cars in the country had to be painted white, the president's favorite color. Niyazov claimed that black brought bad luck and that, in order to purify the country, the vehicles had to follow this absurd change. Citizens were forced to hand in their cars to be repainted, a change that cost money that many did not have, and even more so, a loss of cultural identity and freedom of choice. Another example of government absurdities was the ban on dogs in the capital, Ashgabat. The government claimed that the animals caused an unpleasant odor and were out of place in a city that was supposed to be a showcase of perfection. The ridiculous measure did not stop there. Niyazov ordered entire neighborhoods to be demolished to build monuments and palaces that represented his personal vision of grandeur. And of course, each project was built with luxurious imported materials, such as Italian marble, while the most basic needs of the population, such as access to water, continued to be neglected. And as if that were not enough, the great leader took the time to transform even the country's calendar itself. He renamed the days of the week and the months of the year with new names that, in his view, reflected the grandeur of the regime. Even bread was renamed after his mother, as a way of establishing himself as a deified figure worthy of worship. These bizarre laws and control measures demonstrate how Turkmenistan became a laboratory for a totalitarian regime that spared no expense even for the small joys of everyday life for its citizens. The laws were not just authoritarian, but a way to keep people in line by ensuring that the government's authority was the only thing that mattered. When we talk about the world's most insane regime, it is impossible not to highlight the figure of the leader and the cult of personality that dominated Turkmenistan under Saparmurat Niyazov, and more recently his successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov. The construction of this machine of control began shortly after the country's independence, when Niyazov consolidated power using a combination of political manipulation, brutal repression, and, of course, the cult of his own image. In Turkmenistan, the president was not just a leader. He was the great leader, an almost godlike figure, immortalized in statues, portraits, and street names. His presence was omnipresent. A golden version of Niyazov dominated Independence Square, and his image was displayed in every government office, school, and even commercial establishment. The cult of his personality went so far that he himself changed the national calendar. The month of January, for example, was renamed Turkmen in his honor, and his birthday was established as a national holiday, a sacred date on which everyone was expected to commemorate the great leader. Niyazov also banned all aspects of culture that could in any way compete with the reverence he demanded. Universities were restructured to teach only about his greatness, and even religious education was minimized. The country's predominant Muslim religion was reduced to regime-approved practices, and mosques were required to display images of Niyazov alongside religious images. This cult of personality was intertwined with a ruthless crackdown on any form of dissent. Niyazov's regime was known for its pervasive surveillance and extremely oppressive methods of social control. The secret police, known as the MNB, Ministry of National Security, monitored even the slightest criticism of the government. People were encouraged to denounce each other, and fear of reprisals prevented any form of public expression. Political opponents were frequently arrested, tortured, and disappeared without a trace. Dissidents were often forced to confess to crimes they had not committed, appearing on television shows where they were humiliated and forced to publicly apologize. Many were sent to labor camps or simply disappeared without explanation. This extreme control over freedom of expression was so oppressive that Turkmenistan was ranked among the worst countries in the world in terms of press freedom and human rights. Journalists were frequently arrested or exiled, and the few independent publications that attempted to criticize the government were immediately shut down. Although Niyazov's regime is remembered mainly for its bizarre antics and personality cult, the darkest aspect of his rule was the systematic use of forced labor. Since independence, Turkmenistan's economy has been held hostage to a model of total dependence on natural resources, especially cotton, grown on large plantations using brutal methods. Cotton was long the main economic engine of Turkmenistan. Cotton production was labor-intensive, but what was once a simple agricultural field was transformed into a veritable machine of human exploitation. With an unemployment rate of 70%, the regime forced citizens to leave their jobs and go to the fields to pick cotton, regardless of their profession. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and even children were forced to spend weeks on end under the scorching sun of up to 40 degrees Celsius, working long hours without rest. In 2023, the world was once again shocked to see thousands of people, including minors, being dragged into the cotton fields under threat of severe punishment if they refused to meet their quota. Everyone was required to pick an absurd amount of cotton each day, with penalties for those who failed to meet their quotas. Although the work was grueling, there was no adequate pay, and working conditions were often so harsh that people would collapse from exhaustion or die from the extreme heat. While the people suffered on the plantations, The regime's wealth was maintained at the expense of natural resources such as natural gas and oil. Turkmenistan has some of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, and the regime extracts these resources with ruthless efficiency. However, the profits generated from these resources are not reinvested to improve the lives of the people. Instead, they sustain an oppressive system of government that remains increasingly closed to the outside world. The great irony of the regime is that despite being one of the largest exporters of natural gas, the Turkmen people live with extreme shortages of essential public services such as water, electricity, and sanitation. Access to clean water is extremely limited, especially in rural areas, and public health conditions are poor. Many citizens suffering from a lack of basic resources try to seek a better life outside the country. But this, as we know, is prohibited. On the dark side of the Turkmen economy, forced labor was not limited to cotton cultivation. The regime also exploited workers in the construction of monuments and infrastructure. A prime example was the construction of a brand new city in the capital, Ashgabat, made of imported marble and decorated with gold. But to build the city, the government used the forced labor of thousands of workers, many of whom were displaced from their homes and forced to work in subhuman conditions. These workers were poorly fed, forced to work long hours without rest, and often lived in squalid barracks with no hygiene whatsoever. Deaths during the construction of large projects were common, but the government simply silenced any reports of abuses. The Turkmen regime, in addition to being a totalitarian regime, is also supported by an economy that exploits and dehumanizes the population. Forced labor, the exploitation of natural resources, and the poverty of the population all feed a control machine that silences any attempt at freedom and transforms the country into a living hell for its citizens. The Turkmen regime, marked by its extreme repression and insane policies, has been largely ignored or barely addressed by the international community. This is largely due to the fact that the country is one of the most isolated nations in the world. In addition, its abundance of natural resources, such as natural gas and oil, has attracted the interests of major powers, which has often resulted in a soft or even indifferent international response to the ongoing human rights violations. Rather than facing an economic boycott or more effective international pressure, the Turkmen regime has benefited from a lack of real consequences. Despite its ongoing human rights violations, Turkmenistan maintains diplomatic relations with several international powers, including Russia and China, which in some way endorse its regime. Russia, with its own geopolitical agenda, often ignores the violations committed by the Niyazov regime and later by his successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, in exchange for access to the country's vast natural gas reserves. This access is particularly relevant for Russia, which seeks to ensure the continuity of energy supplies to Europe and Central Asia. China, with its economic growth and growing need for energy sources, also maintains a pragmatic relationship with Turkmenistan. Cooperation between the two countries extends to the exploitation of natural resources, with China acquiring large quantities of Turkmen natural gas. Human rights considerations are thus often sidelined in the pursuit of economic and energy interests. While major powers refrain from taking strong action against the regime, international organizations such as the UN and Amnesty International often issue vague condemnations. In 2019, for example, the UN expressed concerns about the crackdown on freedom of expression and the lack of civil liberties in Turkmenistan. However, such statements rarely translate into practical action, such as meaningful sanctions or diplomatic intervention. The international indifference to the suffering of the Turkmen people reflects an uncomfortable reality for the world. Economic and geopolitical interests often trump the defense of human rights. The international silence regarding the regime was particularly notable during the most critical periods of Niyazov's rule, when allegations of abuses of forced labor, political repression, and social manipulation were constant. During Niyazov's years in office, and even after his death, many international observers limited themselves to general and vague reports on the abuses. The lack of concrete action, whether by international organizations or by Western governments, contributed to the perpetuation of the regime and its inhumane policies. The lack of a more robust global response reflects a failure of moral leadership on the international stage. Turkmenistan's regime continues to be known primarily for its geopolitical isolation, rather than being challenged in any meaningful way. The Turkmen people thus find themselves caught between an oppressive government and an apathetic international community. The legacy of the Niyazov regime and his successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, is marked not only by the oppression and atrocities committed, but also by the perception of an uncertain and fearful future for Turkmenistan. Although the country achieved a degree of political stability under a strong dictatorship, the price of this stability was too high for its people, resulting in a traumatized society with little prospect of meaningful change in the near future. The Niyazov regime and its successors cultivated a system based on corruption and the omission of basic rights. Under Niyazov's rule, the Turkmen economy was systematically expropriated to benefit the ruling elite and the regime's allies. Government incompetence and lack of transparency have made the country one of the most corrupt in the world. Although Turkmenistan is one of the richest countries in terms of natural resources, its middle class is non-existent, and a large portion of the population lives in extreme poverty. Furthermore, censorship and a lack of press freedom persist despite political changes over the years. The repression of freedom of expression and the lack of an active civil society make it difficult for the people to mobilize against the regime and for any attempt to bring about meaningful social change. The lack of political pluralism and the continued dependence on a single leader keep the country hostage to a future of absolute control. After Niyazov's death, the regime was inherited by his successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, who, although he tried to soften some of his predecessors' more extreme policies, maintained a ruthless authoritarian control. Under his leadership, the cult of personality continued and repressive practices were maintained, with some cosmetic changes, such as attempts to modernize the economy and promote a certain openness to the outside world. However, the fear of a new authoritarian dynasty persists. The country lives with a fearful population and a ruling elite that uses violence, censorship, and repression to maintain itself in power. The harsh reality faced by Turkmens is a reflection of a closed and authoritarian system that, while maintaining a status quo of rigid control, also creates a void of hope for its citizens. Even with Berdimuhamedov's superficial reforms, the population continues to live in a state of fear, with no prospects for a better life. Many Turkmens, especially the young, have few options. Either remain in a country where any dissent is punished, or try to flee to other countries in search of freedom and opportunity. Ultimately, the legacy of the regime is not only a legacy of abuse, but also of oblivion and fear. The Turkmen people, despite their abundant natural resources, remain prisoners of a regime that does not allow them to express themselves, that suppresses their aspirations, and that, over time, has shaped a society of resignation and suffering. The future of the country is still uncertain, and what can be expected is a cycle of repression, where any sign of resistance will be crushed without mercy, keeping Turkmenistan in the abyss of international indifference and oblivion in history.